I stood in the dim light of my study, the photograph trembling between my fingers. The edges had worn soft from years of careful handling. The colors faded to the muted tones of memory itself. In the image, two young men laughed at something just beyond the frame, their faces open and unguarded in a way that seemed impossible now. One of them was me, 25 years younger, my arms slung carelessly around the shoulders of the other. Julian. Even his name in my mind felt like touching a bruise that had never quite healed. The photograph had been taken on a summer afternoon when the world felt infinite and forgiving. We had been working at the lake that season, our shirts damp with sweat, our conversations stretching long into the evening hours when the air turned cool and full of promise. Someone had called our names, made us turn toward the camera, and for that single moment we had been caught as we truly were. Not careful, not measured, just us. From the kitchen, Evelyn's voice drifted through the house like a gentle current. Dinner was ready, she called. The sound of her footsteps approached, familiar and steady, the rhythm of a life we had built together step by careful step. My hand moved without conscious thought, sliding the photograph back between the pages of the book where I kept it hidden. The spine read collected poems, though I had never been much for poetry. It seemed fitting somehow that this fragment of my past should rest among verses about love and loss and the things we carry in silence. The book closed with a soft whisper, and I pressed my palm against the cover as if I could keep the memory from escaping. But it was already too late. The image had stirred something in me that I had spent decades learning to quiet, a longing so deep and persistent that it felt like hunger. Later that night, after Evelyn had fallen asleep beside me, her breathing soft and even, I found myself driving through the empty streets of our town. The radio played low, some melancholy song from years past that seemed to understand the weight I carried. The steering wheel felt solid beneath my hands, real in a way that the rest of my life sometimes didn't. I drove without destination, following the pull of streetlights and the promise of solitude. At the rest stop on the highway's edge, I pulled into an empty space and sat in the darkness. The engine ticked as it cooled, the only sound in a world that had gone quiet around me. Through the windshield, I could see the distant glow of the city, all those lives unfolding in their own private dramas of love and regret. You said we'd keep this between us, I whispered to the darkness, and my voice cracked on the words like something fragile finally breaking. The silence that followed felt enormous, filled with all the conversations we had never had, all the truths we had never spoken aloud. I closed my eyes and let the weight of it settle over me, heavy as a blanket, familiar as grief. This was not the beginning of anything. This was a return, a circling back to the place where I had learned to live with half my heart hidden away. Somewhere in the distance, a truck passed on the highway, its headlights sweeping across my windshield like a lighthouse beam, there and gone again, leaving me alone with the echo of words that had shaped the man I had become. Morning light filtered through the kitchen windows, casting everything in the golden hue of respectability. Evelyn moved between the counter and the table with practiced grace, setting out place mats and folding napkins into perfect triangles. The sound of her movements had become the soundtrack of my days, a gentle percussion that marked the hours of the life we had built together. She hummed softly, something classical that I recognized but could never name, and I found myself watching her as if from a great distance. Our house stood on Maple Street, a tree-lined avenue where every lawn was carefully tended and every driveway held sensible cars that started reliably each morning. We had chosen it together 23 years ago, Evelyn and I, walking through rooms that smelled of fresh paint and possibility. The real estate agent had called it perfect for a growing family, and we had nodded and signed papers and made it ours through sheer force of intention. The walls now held the evidence of that intention. Family portraits lined the hallway in matching frames, each one a careful composition of smiles and coordinated clothing. There was our wedding day, Evelyn radiant in white lace, my hand steady on her waist. Christmas mornings with our children small and bright-eyed beneath the tree. Graduation ceremonies and birthday parties and vacation snapshots, each image a testament to a life lived according to plan. Marcus and Clara visited on Sundays now, their own lives pulling them in directions I sometimes struggled to follow. Marcus worked in finance in the city, his conversation filled with terms I pretended to understand. Clara taught elementary school 2 towns over, her voice animated when she spoke about her students, but careful when she mentioned her roommate Sarah, as if she were testing the waters of something she wasn't ready to name. They would sit at our dining room table and tell us about their weeks, their words polite and measured, and then they would hug us goodbye and drive away, leaving behind the particular silence that comes after company departs. I worked as assistant principal at Jefferson Middle School, a position that had found me rather than the other way around. The building smelled of floor wax and adolescent anxiety, its hallways echoing with the chaos of children trying to become themselves. My office sat at the end of the main corridor, its window overlooking the parking lot where teachers gathered during lunch breaks to share cigarettes and gossip. The nameplate on my door read Mr. Nathaniel Hayes in serious black letters, and beneath it hung my diploma and a photograph of Evelyn and the children taken during a beach vacation years ago. My colleagues knew me as the dependable one, the man who arrived early and stayed late, who never missed a faculty meeting and always volunteered for the difficult conversations with angry parents. Principal Rodriguez often said she didn't know what she would do without me, and I would smile and assure her that I was happy to help. In the teacher's lounge, I listened to stories about weekend adventures and relationship dramas, offering appropriate comments and gentle advice, while feeling like an actor who had memorized his lines so well that he sometimes forgot he was performing. The truth was that I moved through my days wrapped in a kind of cotton, everything muffled and distant. I attended parent conferences and school board meetings. I helped plan fundraisers and disciplined students who had lost their way. And through it all, I felt like I was watching myself from somewhere outside my own body. At night, I would tell Evelyn about my day, editing carefully, presenting only the version of myself that made sense in the context of our shared life. But in the bottom drawer of my desk, beneath old budget reports and forgotten memos, lay a single piece of paper that threatened to unravel everything I had so carefully constructed. The letter had arrived 18 months ago, forwarded through 3 different addresses before finding me. The envelope bore no return address, but I had recognized the handwriting immediately, the careful loops and precise angles that belonged to only one person in the world. I had read it once, standing alone in my office after the custodial staff had gone home, and then I had folded it into quarters and hidden it away. But I could still recite every word, could feel the weight of them pressing against my chest whenever I sat at my desk. The letter spoke of memory and regret, of paths not taken and the particular ache of wondering what might have been. It ended with a phone number and the simple words, "If you ever want to talk." 18 months. 547 days of carrying those words around like a stone in my pocket, of catching myself staring at nothing while Evelyn asked if I was feeling all right. 547 nights of lying awake beside my wife, listening to her breathe and wondering if this careful life I had built was shelter or prison. The morning routine continued around me. Evelyn setting out coffee cups and checking the weather on her phone, the familiar choreography of a marriage that had learned to function without requiring too much of either participant. She asked if I wanted toast, and I said yes, because it was easier than explaining that I had lost my appetite for most things lately. Outside, the neighbors were beginning their own morning rituals, backing cars out of driveways and walking dogs along sidewalks that led to predictable destinations. Everything in its place. Everything exactly as it should be. Everything except the part of me that remained hidden, folded away like an old letter that refused to stop whispering its secrets into the silence of my carefully ordered world. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, mixed in with the usual collection of bills and advertisements that Evelyn sorted through while I finished my coffee. She paused at a cream-colored envelope, her eyebrows lifting slightly as she examined the return address. Jefferson High School Alumni Association, she read aloud, passing it across the table to me with the casual interest of someone who had never attended Jefferson High, who had no claim to its memories or ghosts. I recognized the school logo immediately, that fierce eagle with wings spread wide, the same image that had decorated my locker and my letter jacket all those years ago. Inside, the invitation was printed on heavy paper that felt expensive between my fingers. Class of 1989 basketball team reunion. It announced in bold letters, followed by details about dinner and dancing and the promise of reliving our glory days. But it was the list of confirmed attendees that made my breath catch in my throat. The names scrolled down the page in alphabetical order, each one carrying with it a fragment of memory. Bobby Chan, who had played point guard with the intensity of someone fighting for his life. David Martinez, our center, who could make impossible shots look effortless. Then, halfway down the list, a name that hit me like a physical blow, Julian Reeves. 25 years. It had been 25 years since I had spoken his name aloud, since I had allowed myself to think of him as anything more than a carefully buried memory. But there it was, printed in neat black ink, as real and immediate as if he were standing in my kitchen. Julian Reeves. The boy who had been my closest friend, my teammate, my everything in ways I had never learned to articulate. The man who had written the letter that now lay hidden in my desk drawer, asking if I ever wanted to talk. Evelyn was watching me over her coffee cup, her head tilted in the way that meant she was trying to read something in my expression. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, and I forced a smile that felt like putting on a mask I had worn so many times it had molded itself to my face. "Just surprised," I told her. I hadn't thought about these people in years. But that was a lie, and we both knew it. I thought about Julian Reeves every time I saw a pickup truck the color of summer sky, every time I heard certain songs on the radio, every time the light fell in a particular way across our backyard in the early evening. I had been thinking about him for 18 months, ever since his letter had arrived like a message from a life I had convinced myself was safely buried. "You should go," Evelyn said, refilling her coffee cup with the measured movements of someone making a decision on behalf of someone else. "You never do anything for yourself anymore. It might be good for you to see old friends, remember what it was like to be young." I nodded because it was easier than explaining that I remembered being young every single day, that youth wasn't something I had lost but something I had abandoned by choice. She was trying to be kind, trying to give me permission to step outside the careful boundaries of the life we had constructed together. She had no way of knowing that what lay beyond those boundaries was not freedom, but the kind of longing that could destroy everything we had built. That evening, I found myself standing in front of the mirror in our bedroom, trying to imagine what Julian might see when he looked at me now. My hair had gone gray at the temples, and lines had appeared around my eyes that hadn't been there when we were 22. My shoulders were still broad from years of swimming laps at the community center, but there was a softness around my middle that spoke of too many dinner parties and not enough time spent moving through the world with purpose. 3 weeks later, I stood in the parking lot of Jefferson High School, watching my former teammates file through the doors of the gymnasium. The building looked smaller than I remembered, diminished somehow by the intervening years, but the smell hit me as soon as I stepped inside. Floor wax and old wood, and the particular scent of a place where young people had sweated and struggled and dreamed of greatness. The gymnasium had been transformed with white lights strung between the basketball hoops and round tables covered in the school colors of blue and gold. A DJ played music from our era, songs that had soundtracked the best and worst moments of our teenage years. I accepted a name tag from a woman I didn't recognize and made my way toward the crowd, scanning faces for the one that would make this evening either a celebration or a catastrophe. And then I saw him. Julian stood near the far wall, his back to me, talking to a small group of men I recognized but couldn't quite place. His hair was darker than mine, still thick and wavy in a way that made my fingers remember the texture of it. He wore a simple navy shirt that fit him well, and when he laughed at something one of the others said, the sound carried across the room like a song I had been trying to remember for decades. Time collapsed. The gymnasium filled with ghosts, with the echo of bouncing basketballs and the squeak of sneakers on polished wood. I was 17 again, watching Julian sink a three-pointer in the final seconds of the state championship game. feeling my heart leap not just with team pride, but with something deeper and more dangerous that I had never learned to name. He turned then, as if he had felt my eyes on him, and our gazes met across the crowded room. His face changed, softened, and I saw a recognition bloom there along with something that might have been relief. He smiled, the same crooked smile that had undone me when we were boys, and raised his hand in a small wave. I stood frozen, my feet suddenly unable to remember how to move, while 25 years of careful distance evaporated in the space of a heartbeat. This was not a reunion. This was a reckoning. We approached each other slowly, as if we were walking through water, the noise of the reunion fading to a distant hum around us. Julian's smile was cautious but genuine, and when we were close enough to speak, he said my name like he was testing the weight of it on his tongue. Nathaniel. The way he said it carried 25 years of silence, and I found myself struggling to remember how to breathe. The first hour was safe territory. We joined the circle of our former teammates, men who had grown thick around the middle and thin on top, whose faces bore the accumulated weight of mortgages and marriages and the slow compromise of dreams. They clapped us on the shoulders and demanded to know what we had been doing with ourselves, and we fell into the rhythm of polite catching up that reunions demand. Julian had become a carpenter, he told them, working mostly on custom homes in the mountains outside Denver. His hands showed the evidence of his trade, scarred and capable in ways that made me remember how those same hands had once gripped a basketball with perfect confidence. He spoke easily about his work, about the satisfaction of building something that would outlast him, and I found myself watching the movement of his mouth as he talked, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. I told them about my work at the school, about Evelyn and the children, about the quiet predictability of life in a small town. The words felt rehearsed, like lines from a play I had been performing for so long that I had forgotten there might be other roles to audition for. Julian listened with an attention that felt different from the polite interest of the others, as if he were hearing not just what I said, but what I didn't say. As the evening wore on, we found ourselves gravitating toward the edges of the crowd, away from the noise and the forced joviality of middle-aged men trying to recapture something that had never really existed in the first place. Julian suggested we step outside for some air, and I followed him through the emergency exit into the cool night. The parking lot was quieter, punctuated only by the distant sound of traffic and the muffled music from inside. We walked without speaking at first, our footsteps echoing off the asphalt, until Julian stopped beside a pickup truck that could have been the twin of the one he had driven in high school. "Do you remember," he asked, "that summer we worked at the lake?" His voice was careful, testing, as if he were stepping onto ice that might not hold our weight. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. How could I forget? That summer had been a masterpiece of unspoken longing. 3 months of proximity and possibility that had taught me the exact shape of my own heart. We had been hired to help with maintenance at the summer camp where Julian's uncle worked as the director. The days had been long and physical, repairing docks and cleaning cabins and painting anything that would hold still long enough. But it was the evenings I remembered most clearly, when the campers had gone to bed and the two of us would sit on the dock, our feet dangling in the dark water, talking about everything and nothing while the stars came out overhead. Those were good days, Julian said, and there was something in his voice that made me look at him more closely. In the dim light from the parking lot, his face looked younger, more like the boy I had known. I told him they were, and meant it in ways that went deeper than nostalgia. The conversation shifted then, becoming something more dangerous. We talked about the late nights in his car, parked at the end of dirt roads with the headlights off and the radio playing soft. We had told ourselves we were just escaping the suffocating smallness of our town, just two friends who needed space to breathe. But the silence between songs had been charged with something we had never dared to name, and more than once I had felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing, warm and unsettling and absolutely forbidden. When the reunion ended, we walked to our cars together, the evening settling around us like a question that neither of us was ready to answer. Julian handed me a piece of paper with his phone number written in the same careful script I remembered from high school. "In case you want to catch up more," he said, and I folded the paper into my wallet with hands that trembled more than I would have liked. I drove home in a state that felt like fever, hyper-aware of every sensation. The steering wheel beneath my palms, the hum of the engine, the way the headlights carved through the darkness ahead of me. When I slipped into bed beside Evelyn, she stirred and asked if I had enjoyed myself. I told her it had been nice to see everyone, and she made a sleepy sound of approval before settling back into her dreams. But nice was not the word for what had happened to me that night. Nice was safe, predictable, appropriate. What I felt was like a door opening after being locked for so long that I had forgotten there was anything beyond it. Julian had awakened something in me that I had spent decades learning to suppress, and I was both terrified and exhilarated by the intensity of it. The phone call started 3 days later. Casual at first, brief conversations about the reunion and shared memories of people we had both known. But they grew longer, more frequent, until I found myself looking forward to them with an anticipation that felt dangerous. Julian's voice on the other end of the line was like a drug I had forgotten I was addicted to, and I would catch myself smiling while we talked in ways that had nothing to do with what he was saying and everything to do with the simple fact that he was there. We began meeting for coffee at a small cafe on the outskirts of town, a place where we were unlikely to run into anyone who might ask questions about why the assistant principal was spending so much time with a man from out of town. Julian would drive down from Denver, claiming he had business in the area, and we would sit in a corner booth for hours, the conversation flowing as easily as if no time had passed at all. Evelyn noticed the change in me before I did. She commented on my improved mood, the way I hummed while making coffee in the morning, the fact that I had started wearing cologne again. When she asked what had gotten into me, I told her I had been helping with reunion committee details, planning a memorial for teammates who had died over the years. The lie came so easily that it frightened me, but it was easier than trying to explain something I didn't fully understand myself. Julian was still magnetic in all the ways that had drawn me to him when we were boys, but there was something new as well, a kind of settled confidence that came from a man who had learned to be comfortable in his own skin. He talked about his work with genuine passion, about the houses he was building and the satisfaction of creating something beautiful and permanent. He mentioned a relationship that had ended badly, a woman who had wanted him to be someone he wasn't, and there was a sadness in his voice that made me want to reach across the table and touch his hand. One evening, as we walked to our cars after dinner at a restaurant in the next town over, Julian stopped beside my door and turned to face me. The parking lot was empty except for our 2 vehicles, and the silence stretched between us like a held breath. He reached out then, his fingers brushing against mine in a touch that lasted a moment too long to be accidental. The contact sent a shock through me that I felt in my bones, and I pulled my hand away so quickly that I knocked my keys to the asphalt. Julian bent to retrieve them, and when he straightened, our faces were closer than they had been since we were young. I could smell his cologne, could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. He handed me the keys, and our fingers touched again, deliberately this time. Neither of us moved to break the contact, and I felt my breath catch in my throat like something wild trying to escape. Julian's eyes searched my face, looking for something, and I knew that what he found there gave me away completely. The tremor in my breathing, the way my pulse jumped at my throat, the fact that I made no move to step back even though every instinct I had developed over the past 25 years was screaming at me to run. We stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, balanced on the edge of something that would change everything. Then a car turned into the parking lot, its headlights sweeping across us, and the spell broke. I stepped back, fumbling with my keys, and Julian cleared his throat and said goodnight in a voice that sounded carefully normal. I drove home with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, my heart pounding like I had been running for miles. In the bathroom, I stared at my reflection and saw a man I barely recognized, someone whose face was flushed and whose eyes held a light that hadn't been there in decades. I was awake and alive and absolutely terrified, because I knew that what had started that night in the parking lot was not something I could control or contain or file away in the drawer with all my other carefully buried secrets. Julian had seen me, really seen me, in ways that no one had in 25 years. And the man he had seen looking back at him was not the careful, measured assistant principal who went to school board meetings and helped plan fundraisers. It was someone rawer and more honest, someone who had been waiting all these years for permission to exist. The storm rolled in from the west on a Thursday evening in late October, the kind of weather that turns the world gray and makes everything feel smaller, more intimate. I had been sitting in my study, grading papers that blurred together in meaningless patterns of teenage handwriting, when Julian called. His voice sounded different, rougher somehow, and he mentioned that he had left his jacket in my car the last time we had dinner together. The jacket had been hanging in my closet for 3 days. I had found it there after dropping him off, a worn leather thing that smelled like sawdust, and something indefinably him, and I had left it hanging there like a talisman, like proof that our meetings were real and not something I had imagined in my desperation for connection. I could have waited until the weekend to return it, could have suggested meeting at our usual cafe when the weather cleared. Instead, I found myself telling him I would drive out to his place, that it was no trouble, that I needed to get out of the house anyway. The lie slipped out so easily that I barely recognized it as deception, though the truth was that I had been looking for an excuse to see where he lived, to step inside the space he had made for himself. The rain started as I pulled into his driveway, fat drops that splattered against my windshield and turned the evening air thick and electric. Julian's house was smaller than I had expected, a craftsman bungalow tucked back among tall pines, the kind of place that looked like it had grown from the landscape rather than being imposed upon it. Light glowed warm in the windows, and I could see the silhouette of him moving inside, real and solid and waiting. He opened the door before I could knock, standing there in jeans and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his hair damp as if he had just stepped out of the shower. The sight of him in this domestic setting hit me with unexpected force, and I had to remind myself why I was there, holding up the jacket like evidence of my legitimate purpose. "Come in," he said, stepping back to let me pass. "You're getting soaked out there." The rain drummed against the roof with increasing intensity, and he closed the door behind me with a soft click that felt like sealing us away from the rest of the world. The house was exactly what I would have expected if I had allowed myself to imagine it. Wooden floors worn smooth by decades of use, built-in bookshelves lined with volumes on architecture and woodworking, furniture that looked handmade and comfortable rather than fashionable. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and the air smelled of coffee and wood smoke and something that might have been dinner. He took the jacket from me and hung it on a peg by the door, then asked if I wanted something to drink. The rain was coming down harder now, he said, and it didn't look like it would let up anytime soon. I accepted a cup of coffee and followed him to the living room, where we sat on opposite ends of his couch like two people who had not spent the last month learning to recognize the sound of each other's breathing over the phone. For a while we talked about safe things. The storm, his work on a house up in the mountains, my struggles with the school's new computer system. But as the evening deepened and the rain continued its steady percussion against the windows, our conversation began to drift toward more dangerous territory. He asked if I remembered the night we had driven out to Miller's Pond during our senior year, and of course I did. How could I forget? It had been after a game we had lost, a crushing defeat that had ended our hopes for the state championship. We had been devastated, raw with disappointment, and the particular grief of 18-year-olds who thought that nothing would ever matter as much as basketball. Julian had suggested we get out of town, just drive until we found somewhere to think, and I had followed him without question because following Julian had always felt like the most natural thing in the world. We had ended up at the pond, parked with the headlights off and the radio playing soft. I had been crying. I remembered with sudden clarity, not just for the game, but for something larger and more frightening that I couldn't name. Julian had reached over and touched my shoulder, his hand warm and steady, and I had wanted to lean into that touch with a desperation that terrified me. "You were so broken that night," Julian said softly, his eyes fixed on the fire rather than on me. "I wanted to fix it, to fix you, but I didn't know how. We sat there for hours, and I kept thinking that if I could just find the right words, I could take away whatever was hurting you so much. I stared at him, my coffee growing cold in my hands. The memory was sharp and clear now, more vivid than it had been in years. I could see his face in the dim light from the dashboard, the way his eyes had searched mine as if he were looking for something specific. And I could remember the moment when he had leaned closer, when the space between us had contracted to almost nothing, when I had felt his breath against my cheek and known with absolute certainty that he was about to kiss me. But I had pulled back, had made some excuse about needing to get home, about my parents worrying, had broken the spell before it could become something real and irreversible. Julian had driven me home in silence, and we had never spoken of that night again, though it had hung between us like smoke for the rest of senior year. You remember what we had, don't you? Julian's voice was barely above a whisper, and when I looked at him, he was watching me with an intensity that made my chest tight. Even if we never named it, even if we pretended it was something else. I opened my mouth to deny it, to fall back on the careful lies I had been telling myself for 25 years. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I felt something crumbling inside me, some wall I had built so carefully that I had forgotten it was there until it began to collapse. We were just friends, I managed, but my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. We were kids. We didn't know what we were doing. Julian leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together. The firelight played across his face, and I could see the boy he had been overlaid with the man he had become, both versions of him looking at me with the same patient understanding that had undone me when we were 18. I knew exactly what I was doing, he said quietly. I was falling in love with my best friend, and I was terrified that if I said it out loud, I would lose the only person who had ever really seen me. The words hit me like a physical blow, driving the air from my lungs. I stood up abruptly, coffee sloshing from my cup onto his wooden floor, and moved to the window where I could watch the rain streak down the glass in patterns that made no sense. Behind me, I could hear Julian breathing, waiting, giving me space to process what he had just confessed. You said we'd keep this between us, I whispered, and my voice cracked on the words like something fragile finally breaking. You said it didn't have to mean anything, that we could just forget it happened. But even as I spoke, I knew I was lying. We had never said any of those things because we had never allowed ourselves to get that far. We had existed in the space between friendship and something deeper, dancing around the truth without ever quite touching it. And the weight of all that unspoken longing had followed me through 25 years of careful, constructed normalcy. I felt Julian move behind me, felt the warmth of his presence even before his hand touched my shoulder. When I turned around, he was close enough that I could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, could count the lines that time had etched at their corners. I never forgot, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Not for a single day, and I don't think you did either. The silence that followed was enormous, filled with everything we had never said, everything we had been too young and too frightened to acknowledge. I could feel my careful walls crumbling, could feel the man I had been for the past 25 years dissolving like sugar in rain. When Julian stepped closer, I didn't move away. When he raised his hand to touch my face, I let him. And when he kissed me, finally, after all these years of wondering and wanting and pretending that I didn't, I kissed him back with 25 years of suppressed longing. It was not the kiss of young men who thought they had forever to figure things out. It was desperate and trembling and tinged with the particular grief of time lost, of chances not taken when we might have been brave enough to take them. It tasted like regret and hope and the salt of tears I hadn't realized I was crying. When we finally broke apart, I was shaking. Julian rested his forehead against mine, his breath warm against my skin, and we stood there in the flickering firelight while the storm raged outside, and something equally powerful raged inside me. I had spent 25 years telling myself that what I felt for Julian Reeves was safely buried, that I had successfully built a life that had nothing to do with the confused desires of my youth. But standing there in his living room, his taste still on my lips and his scent filling my lungs, I knew with devastating clarity that I had never let go at all. I had simply learned to live with the ache of missing him, had made that ache so much a part of myself that I had forgotten what it felt like to be whole. I drove home through the storm in a state that felt like falling, my hands trembling on the steering wheel, Julian's taste still warm on my lips. The rain had turned to a steady downpour that made the familiar streets look foreign and uncertain, and I had to concentrate on each turn, each stop sign, as if I were navigating territory I had never seen before. My reflection in the rearview mirror showed a man I barely recognized, someone whose face was flushed and whose eyes held a wild light that spoke of boundaries crossed and careful walls torn down. The house was dark except for the porch light Evelyn always left on for me, a beacon of domesticity that felt both welcoming and accusatory. I sat in the driveway for a long moment, watching the rain stream down my windshield, trying to compose myself into the shape of the man who belonged in that house. But something fundamental had shifted during those hours with Julian, and I couldn't seem to find my way back to the careful persona I had worn for so many years. Inside, I expected to find Evelyn asleep, but the soft glow from the living room told me she was still awake. I found her curled on the couch with a book in her lap, reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, looking every inch the picture of patient domesticity. She glanced up as I entered, and her smile was warm but questioning. "You're later than I expected," she said, closing her book and setting it aside. "How did the committee meeting go?" For a moment, I couldn't remember what lie I had told her, what excuse I had given for my evening absence. The fictional reunion committee felt like something from another life, a story told by a man who no longer existed. I mumbled something about the meeting running long, about getting caught in the rain, and moved toward the stairs with the desperate hope that I could escape to the bathroom and wash away the evidence of what had happened. But Evelyn was watching me with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read the subtle signs of a marriage lived in parallel rather than together. She tilted her head, her expression shifting from casual interest to something sharper, more focused. "Nathaniel," she said softly, and there was something in her voice that made me stop, my foot on the bottom step. "Are you all right? You look different." I turned to face her, trying to arrange my features into something resembling normalcy, but I could see in her eyes that I was failing. She stood up from the couch, moving toward me with the same careful grace she brought to everything, and I felt like an animal caught in headlights, frozen and exposed. "Just tired," I told her, but my voice sounded strange even to my own ears, rougher and more fragile than usual. "It's been a long day." She stopped a few feet away from me, close enough that I could smell her familiar scent of lavender and vanilla, close enough that I could see the concern growing in her eyes. We stood there in the hallway that we had walked together for 23 years, surrounded by the photographs and furniture and accumulated detritus of a shared life, and I felt the weight of my deception settling over me like a lead blanket. "You've been different lately," she said, her voice careful and measured. "Happier, I thought at first. But now," she trailed off, studying my face with the attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle that had been troubling her for weeks. I wanted to lie to her again, to manufacture some explanation that would send her back to her book and her quiet evening, that would let me retreat upstairs and figure out how to live with what had happened. But standing there under her patient gaze, I found that the lies wouldn't come. The careful machinery of deception that I had operated for so many years seemed to have broken down completely. Evelyn stepped closer, and I could see my own reflection in her eyes, could see the man she had married overlaid with the stranger I was becoming. When she reached out to touch my face, her fingers came away damp, and I realized with shock that I was crying without having been aware of it. "Oh," she whispered, and the sound was full of a terrible understanding. "Oh, Nathaniel." The silence that followed was enormous, containing 23 years of careful politeness and unexamined distance, of parallel lives that had intersected at dinner tables and school events and family holidays, but had never quite touched at their cores. I could see her putting together pieces of a puzzle she had never wanted to solve, seeing patterns in my behavior that she had been choosing not to notice. "Is there someone else?" The question came out as barely more than a whisper, but it hit me like a physical blow. She didn't ask it with anger or accusation, but with the weary sadness of someone who had been expecting this conversation for longer than she cared to admit. I opened my mouth to deny it, to fall back on the reflexive dishonesty that had become as natural as breathing. But the words stuck in my throat, and my silence stretched between us like a chasm that could not be crossed. That silence was answer enough, and I watched something break behind her eyes, some last vestige of hope that she had been carrying without realizing it. The tears came then, not the dramatic sobs of betrayal, but the quiet weeping of someone who had just understood something that had been true for a very long time. She didn't ask me who it was, or how long it had been going on, or any of the other questions that a wronged wife might have demanded. Instead, she sank onto the bottom step of the staircase and put her face in her hands. "How long have I been living with a ghost?" she asked, and her voice was muffled but clear. "How long have you been somewhere else while sitting right beside me?" I wanted to comfort her, to tell her that she was wrong, that what we had built together was real and meaningful and worth preserving. But the truth was that she was right, that I had been a ghost in my own life for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to be fully present anywhere. I had been an actor playing the role of husband and father and respectable citizen, and I had played it so well that even I had sometimes believed the performance was real. 3 days later, I met Julian at the same cafe where we had begun this careful dance of reconnection. He was waiting in our usual booth, but something in his posture told me that he knew this meeting would be different from the others. His face was carefully composed, but I could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, the way his hands wrapped around his coffee cup as if it were an anchor. I slid into the seat across from him and tried to find words for the chaos that my life had become. Evelyn and I had been living in a careful ceasefire since that night in the hallway, polite and distant, moving around each other like survivors of some natural disaster. She had asked no more questions, and I had offered no more explanations. But the air in our house had become thick with unspoken truths. "I don't know how to do this," I told Julian, my voice shaking with the effort of honesty. "I've built a life, a whole life, and it has roots and foundations and people depending on it. But it was never mine, was it? I was just borrowing it, pretending it fit." Julian reached across the table and covered my hand with his, a gesture so simple and natural that it made my chest ache with longing. His touch was warm and steady, and I could feel the calluses on his palms from years of working with wood and tools. This was real, I thought. This connection, this moment, this man who saw me without requiring me to explain or perform or apologize for who I was. "I never stopped holding on," he said quietly, his thumb tracing across my knuckles. "For 25 years, I carried you with me. But this has to be your choice, Nathaniel. I won't be the reason you destroy something that matters to you." The weight of it was unbearable. On one side lay everything I had built over the course of a quarter-century. My marriage to Evelyn, my relationship with my children, my position in the community, the respect and stability that came with living according to expectations. On the other side lay the possibility of authenticity, of finally stepping into the truth of who I was and who I had always been, even when I lacked the courage to admit it. I thought about Evelyn, sitting in our living room with her book and her patient sadness, and I knew that she deserved better than a husband who had been pretending for 23 years. I thought about Marcus and Clara, and wondered if they would understand that their father's happiness might require dismantling the only version of him they had ever known. I thought about the school, about Principal Rodriguez and the teacher's lounge, and the life I had built in careful increments of respectability. And then I looked at Julian, at the man who had been carrying a piece of my heart for 25 years without asking for anything in return, and I felt something settle into place inside me. Not peace, exactly, but a kind of terrible clarity. The choice was mine to make, and I was finally ready to make it. The kitchen table had never felt so large or so empty. I sat in the chair I had occupied for 23 years, watching the morning light creep across the surface where Evelyn and I had shared thousands of meals, where we had helped our children with homework and planned family vacations, and discussed the mundane details that make up a life lived in parallel. Now the silence was absolute. broken only by the steady tick of the clock on the wall and the distant sound of traffic beginning the day's familiar rhythms. My wedding ring sat on the counter beside me, a circle of gold that caught the early light and threw it back in fragments. I had slipped it off my finger an hour ago, not in anger or dramatic gesture, but with the careful deliberation of someone finally acknowledging a truth that had been growing for months. The pale band of skin it had protected looked vulnerable and strange, like a secret finally exposed to air. The suitcase waited by the front door, packed with enough clothes for a few days and the few possessions that felt essentially mine. Everything else belonged to the life I had constructed, the careful edifice of respectability that would continue standing even after I walked away from it. Evelyn would keep the house, would explain my absence to the neighbors and our children with whatever story felt most bearable. She was stronger than I had ever given her credit for, and I knew she would find her way to a version of happiness that didn't require her to live with a ghost. I reached into my shirt pocket and withdrew the photograph, the one that had started this unraveling months ago. Julian and I, young and laughing and unaware that we were being documented in a moment of pure joy. I set it gently on the table beside the letter I had carried in my desk drawer for 18 months, the words that had reached across 25 years of silence to remind me that some things never die. They simply wait. For the first time in decades, I didn't hide them away. The letter was worn soft from folding and unfolding, its edges frayed like something that had been handled too much and treasured too little. I smoothed it flat against the wood grain of the table and read Julian's words one more time, the careful script that had offered me a lifeline when I hadn't even realized I was drowning. "If you ever want to talk," it ended, and I had carried those words like a talisman through months of careful meetings and cautious conversations and the gradual awakening of a part of myself I had thought safely buried. The sun was fully up now, painting the kitchen in shades of gold and amber that made everything look softer, more forgiving. Outside, I could hear the sounds of a neighborhood beginning its day. Car doors slamming, children calling to each other as they waited for the school bus, the rumble of delivery trucks making their rounds. Life continuing in its endless, ordinary way, indifferent to the small revolution happening in my kitchen. I stood up slowly, my joints protesting after an hour of sitting motionless, and walked to the window that looked out over the backyard Evelyn and I had tended together for so many years. The garden was ready for winter, the roses pruned back and the flower beds covered with mulch, everything put to rest until spring brought the possibility of new growth. It was beautiful in its dormant way, holding the promise of renewal in its sleeping roots. My phone buzzed softly against the counter, and I knew without looking that it was Julian. We had planned to meet this morning, to talk about what came next, to begin the careful work of building something real from the fragments of what we had almost had when we were young. I let it buzz unanswered, knowing that he would understand. Some moments required solitude, demanded the space to be fully experienced without the pressure of explanation or decision. The house held its breath around me, 23 years of accumulated life pressing against my shoulders like the weight of history. I thought about the Christmas mornings and birthday parties that had played out in these rooms, about the fights and reconciliations and quiet compromises that make up a marriage. It had been a good life, measured by most standards, and I felt no anger toward it or toward the people who had shared it with me. But it had never been mine, not really. I had been a visitor in my own existence, playing a role so completely that I had forgotten there might be other parts to audition for. I picked up the photograph and the letter, holding them together like a prayer book, and walked toward the front door. The suitcase felt lighter than it should have, as if the act of choosing had somehow defied gravity. I paused at the threshold, my hand on the doorknob, and looked back at the hallway lined with family portraits, at the evidence of a life lived according to plan. Then I opened the door and stepped outside. The morning air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of change. I stood on the porch for a moment, breathing deeply, feeling my lungs expand in ways they hadn't for years. Behind me, the house waited in its patient silence. Ahead of me, the world spread out in all directions, full of uncertainty and possibility, and the particular terror that comes with choosing authenticity over safety. I didn't know where I was going. Julian's house in the mountains, perhaps, where we could finally have the conversations we had been too young to risk 25 years ago. Or simply forward, into whatever version of myself was waiting to be discovered beyond the careful boundaries I had spent a lifetime constructing. What mattered was not the destination, but the movement itself, the act of finally stepping into the current of my own life instead of standing safely on the shore. The photograph in my hand caught the morning light, and for a moment I could see Julian's young face looking back at me with all the hope and trust and uncomplicated love that we had been too frightened to claim. I could see my own face too, open and unguarded in a way that I was only now learning to be again. I took a step forward, then another, and with each footfall I felt something loosening in my chest, some knot of tension that had been pulled tight for so long I had forgotten it was there. The air moved through my lungs unobstructed for the first time in decades, full and clean and finally, completely mine.